Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video provides a historical and demographic analysis of marriage and divorce trends in the United States for educational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Divorce laws vary significantly by state and are subject to change. Historical data does not predict individual outcomes. Viewers should consult with qualified family law attorneys, financial planners, or mental health professionals regarding their specific circumstances. Always conduct your own due diligence before making significant life decisions. For decades, you have been told that 50% of marriages end in divorce. It is the most cited statistic in American social science, yet it is fundamentally misleading. If you are a man in America today, the reality of the demographic landscape is far more complex, far more targeted, and historically unprecedented. We are currently living through what sociologists call the Great Marital Divide. While divorce rates for some groups are plummeting to 30-year lows, for others, they are reaching a boiling point. The traditional nuclear family is not just changing. It is being restructured along lines of education, age, and economic status. If you do not understand the historical shifts that brought us to this moment, you are essentially flying blind into the most significant legal and financial contract of your life. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the raw data to show you exactly who is getting divorced, why the timing has shifted, and how the ghost of 1970s legislation still dictates the domestic life of the modern American male. This deep dive solves the primary problem facing men in the current dating and marital market: the lack of objective, data-driven clarity. Most men approach marriage based on social pressure or romantic idealism, unaware of the statistical headwinds they face. By the end of this series, you will understand the precise demographic markers that correlate with marital stability, the historical evolution of the no-fault era, and how to interpret modern trends like gray divorce or the marriage gap. This is not about cynicism. It is about providing you with a high-level map of the terrain, so you can make informed decisions based on historical trends and case studies, rather than myths. To understand where we are, we have to look at the massive shift that occurred in the mid-20th century. Before 1969, divorce in the United States was based on the fault system. To dissolve a marriage, a husband or wife had to prove wrongdoing, such as adultery, abandonment, or extreme cruelty. This created a high barrier to entry for the legal system. However, the introduction of no-fault divorce, beginning with California's Family Law Act signed by Ronald Reagan, fundamentally altered the demographic trajectory of the country. This transition meant that a marriage could be dissolved for irreconcilable differences without the need for a villain. From a demographic perspective, this led to the divorce peak of the late 1970s and early 1980s. During this window, the United States saw its highest divorce rates in history. For men of the baby boomer generation, this was a period of extreme volatility. The sudden shift in legal accessibility meant that a backlog of unhappy marriages was unleashed into the court system simultaneously. When people cite the 50% divorce rate, they are usually looking at a snapshot of this specific historical anomaly. However, if we look at men who married after 1990, the data tells a completely different story. One of the most critical demographic factors for men today is the education gap. Data from the National Center for Health Statistics reveals a stark divergence in marital outcomes based on educational attainment. Men with a 4-year college degree are significantly more likely to reach their 20th wedding anniversary than those with a high school diploma or less. This is often referred to as the marriage protection effect of education. Case studies suggest this isn't just about the degree itself, but about the economic stability and delayed marriage age that typically accompany higher education. In the 1950s, people married young and then built a life together. In the 2020s, the demographic trend for successful marriages involves building a career first and marrying later, typically after age 30. Furthermore, we must examine the silver tsunami, or gray divorce phenomenon. While divorce rates for younger generations have actually stabilized or decreased, the rate for men over the age of 50 has doubled since 1990. This is a crucial historical trend for any man to understand. The factors driving this are unique: increased life expectancy, the ending of the empty nest phase, and the financial independence of both partners. For the modern man, this means that the danger zone for marital dissolution has shifted. It is no longer just the 7-year itch of the early 30s. There is now a secondary peak occurring after 25 or 30 years of marriage. Understanding this allows a man to view marriage as a long-term management project, rather than a set-it-and-forget-it achievement. The economic landscape has also redefined the demographics of who stays together. Historically, the man was the primary breadwinner, creating a clear, albeit rigid, domestic structure. Today, in nearly 30% of dual-income households in the U.S., the wife earns as much as or more than the husband. Demographic studies indicate that shifts in traditional roles can lead to higher marital friction if expectations are not calibrated. However, the data also shows that egalitarian marriages, where domestic labor is shared more equitably, are becoming the most stable models for younger cohorts, millennials and Gen Z. The old traditional model that worked in 1955 often acts as a precursor for divorce in 2026 because the underlying economic support structures have vanished. Another layer of this deep dive involves the geography of divorce. Where a man lives in the United States significantly impacts his statistical likelihood of divorce. Southern states, often referred to as the Bible Belt, ironically have some of the highest divorce rates in the country. This correlates with demographic markers such as younger ages at first marriage and lower average household incomes. Conversely, states in the Northeast often show lower divorce rates, which correlates with higher ages at first marriage and higher levels of education. If you are a man planning a life, you must realize that your local environment and social circles norms are a demographic invisible hand. We also have to address the parental status variable. Historically, the presence of children was seen as a stabilizer for marriage. Modern demographic data suggests this is a double-edged sword. While couples with children are statistically less likely to divorce in the short term, the stress of modern parenting in an era without extended family support, the village, can lead to a sharp decline in marital satisfaction. Men who understand the U-shaped curve of marital happiness, which typically dips during the child-rearing years and rises again after children leave the home, are better equipped to navigate the decades where the risk of dissolution is highest. Finally, we look at the remarriage trap. The demographics of second and third marriages are significantly more perilous than first marriages. For a man entering a second marriage, the statistical probability of divorce jumps from roughly 40% to 60%, and for a third marriage, it climbs to over 70%. This is a critical case study in behavioral patterns. Often, the factors that led to the first divorce are carried into the second, but with the added complexity of blended families, child support, and previous alimony obligations. This part 1 has set the stage by deconstructing the 50% myth and highlighting that your education, age, and location are the true predictors of your marital path. In the following sections, we will break down the financial mechanics and the specific legal evolutions that every man in the U.S. needs to know to protect his future. To understand the current state of divorce in 2026, we have to look at the financial mechanics that were set in motion over half a century ago. The shift from a fault-based system to a no-fault system did more than just make it easier to exit a marriage. It fundamentally redefined how the American legal system views marital property and the future earning potential of the male spouse. In the early 20th century, the legal concept of coverture was still casting a long shadow, where a woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband's. When that system dissolved, it was replaced by the concept of equitable distribution and community property. These are not just legal terms. They are the financial blueprints that determine the next 30 years of your life if a marriage dissolves. Imagine a man named David living in Austin, Texas, in 2026. David is 42 years old and has spent the last 15 years building a specialized medical consulting firm. He married his college sweetheart at 25. At the time, they had a combined net worth of nearly zero. Over the years, David worked 80-hour weeks while his spouse managed the household and worked part-time. In a community property state like Texas, the law generally views every dollar earned and every asset acquired during the marriage as owned 50-50, regardless of whose name is on the paycheck or the title. This is the first major historical trend men must grasp: the shift from title-based ownership to marital effort ownership. The law assumes that David's success was only possible because of the domestic support provided by his spouse. When David enters a courtroom, the judge isn't looking at who worked the late nights. The judge is looking at a ledger that began the day they said their vows. Now, compare David to Michael, who lives in New York, an equitable distribution state. In Michael's case, the division isn't necessarily a clean 50-50 split. The court looks at what is fair, which sounds more flexible but can often be more unpredictable. The court considers the duration of the marriage, the age and health of both parties, and the future earning capacity of each person. If Michael's career is on an upward trajectory while his spouse has been out of the workforce, the court may award a larger portion of the current assets to the spouse to offset the disparity in future income. This historical evolution from property as a physical asset to property as a concept of future security is a central pillar of modern divorce demographics. The most significant financial mechanism that has evolved since the 1970s is the treatment of retirement accounts and professional licenses. Historically, a man's pension was his own. Today, through the use of a Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO, a retirement account is often sliced right down the middle before a man even sees a penny of it in his 60s. This is a demographic reality that hits men particularly hard, because men are statistically more likely to rely on employer-sponsored 401k plans as their primary vehicle for wealth accumulation. When 50% of that vehicle is removed in your late 40s or 50s, the math for retirement changes from a sure thing to a precarious climb. We must also analyze the historical trend of alimony, now more commonly referred to as spousal maintenance. In the 1950s, alimony was often a lifelong commitment, based on the idea that a woman was permanently dependent on her husband. By the 2020s, the trend has shifted toward rehabilitative alimony. This is designed to be temporary, providing the lower-earning spouse with enough time to gain education or training to become self-sufficient. However, for many men in the upper middle class, the potential outcome still involves significant monthly transfers that can last for a duration of 1/3 to 1/2 the length of the marriage. Case studies show that for men earning over $150,000 annually, the maintenance payments are often the single largest factor in their inability to rebuild their net worth post-divorce. Data from 2026 indicates that the most successful demographic of men, those who maintain their wealth after a domestic split, are those who understood the difference between separate and marital property from day one. Separate property typically includes assets you brought into the marriage or gifts and inheritances received specifically by you. But here is the trap: commingling. If you take an inheritance of $50,000 and put it into a joint savings account to pay for a kitchen remodel, that separate property has likely been transmuted into marital property in the eyes of the court. This is a step-by-step erosion of individual wealth that most men don't notice until the legal discovery process begins. The evolution of child support is another historical shift that requires deep analysis. In the mid-20th century, child support was often haphazard and poorly enforced. Today, it is governed by rigid state guidelines and federal enforcement mechanisms. In 2026, these calculations are often automated based on gross income, the number of overnights spent with each parent, and the cost of health insurance. For the modern man, this represents a fixed cost that is largely non-negotiable. Even in cases of 50-50 shared custody, which has become the demographic norm in many states, a higher-earning father may still be required to pay support to ensure the child maintains a similar standard of living in both households. This historical movement toward the best interests of the child has created a permanent financial tie that persists until the child reaches 18 or, in some states, finishes college. Consider the historical trend of the family home. For previous generations, the goal was to pay off the mortgage and keep the home forever. In the modern divorce demographic, the home is often an albatross. High interest rates in the mid-2020s have made it nearly impossible for one spouse to buy out the other's equity and refinance the mortgage under a single name. This leads to the forced sale of the primary asset, often at a time that is not market optimal, further depleting the capital available to the man as he tries to establish a new household. The cost of maintaining two households on the same income that previously supported one is the primary reason why the post-divorce standard of living for men often drops significantly in the first 3 years. But what about the hidden costs? The demographic data rarely accounts for the soft costs of litigation and expert witnesses. In 2026, a contested divorce involving a business valuation or a forensic audit of assets can easily cost each party tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. This is wealth that simply evaporates from the family unit and enters the legal ecosystem. Men who are unprepared for the adversarial nature of the process often find themselves in a war of attrition where the only winners are the professionals billed by the hour. This is why understanding the historical shift toward mediation and collaborative law is essential for any man looking to preserve his financial legacy. The demographics of divorce are not just about who leaves, they are about what stays. As we have seen, the legal and financial structures of the U.S. have moved from a model of individual ownership to one of collective partnership, often catching men off guard when that partnership dissolves. But the financial aspect is only the surface. Beneath the numbers lies a complex web of psychological triggers and tactical maneuvers that have been refined over decades of courtroom battles. If you think the division of assets is the hardest part, you haven't seen how the legal system handles the most valuable thing in a man's life: his time and his relationship with his children. How did the U.S. move from a society that favored the mother in almost 90% of custody cases to the modern era of shared parenting? And why is this trend now being challenged by new legislative pushes in 2026? What are the specific demographic markers of the tactical divorce that some men are using to protect their interests before a filing even occurs? In the next part, we go deep into the custody wars, the psychological profile of the modern family court, and the specific strategies used to navigate the most high-stakes negotiations a father will ever face. The transition from the tender years doctrine to the contemporary standard of the best interests of the child represents one of the most radical demographic shifts in United States legal history. To navigate the family court system in 2026, a man must first understand that for nearly a century, the deck was stacked by a specific psychological theory. The tender years doctrine, which prevailed through much of the 20th century, operated on the demographic assumption that mothers were inherently better suited to care for young children, particularly those under the age of 7. This historical trend meant that unless a mother was proven significantly unfit, fathers were relegated to visiting weekends and Wednesday night dinners. This created a generation of disenfranchised fathers and shaped the modern male's fear of the family court system. However, as we move through 2026, the data shows a massive correction. We are currently seeing the rise of 50-50 default custody legislation across various states. Imagine a father named Robert in Florida. Under the old historical trends, Robert would have entered the courtroom fighting an uphill battle to prove why he deserved time with his kids. But in the current legal climate, the baseline has shifted. In many jurisdictions, the court now begins with the assumption that equal time is the starting point. This is a monumental shift in the demographics of fatherhood. Case studies from states like Kentucky and Arizona, which pioneered these equal parenting laws, show a significant decrease in high-conflict litigation. When the win-all, lose-all incentive is removed, the demographic of the warring parents begins to stabilize into a demographic of co-parents. But don't mistake this trend for a simple path. The best interests of the child standard is intentionally broad and subjective, giving judges immense power. In 2026, the court looks at a variety of factors that every man must be prepared to document. This includes the emotional ties between the parent and child, the capacity of the parent to provide food, clothing, and medical care, and the stability of the home environment. Historical trends show that men often lose ground here not because they are less capable, but because they lack the paper trail of involvement. In the demographic of successful 50-50 outcomes, the fathers are those who can produce logs of doctor appointments, school meetings, and extracurricular participation. This is the move from being a provider to being a caregiver in the eyes of the law. Consider the imagine-if scenario of a contested custody battle in a high-stakes environment like New York or California. If the parents cannot agree, the court introduces a series of third-party professionals that fundamentally change the demographic of the divorce. You have the attorney for the child, often called a law guardian, and the custody evaluator, typically a forensic psychologist. This is where the psychological profile of the modern family court becomes visceral. These evaluators spend months observing the family dynamic, conducting psychological testing, and interviewing teachers. For a man in 2026, his potential outcomes are often decided not by his testimony, but by how he interacts with these gatekeepers. Historical trends suggest that men who appear angry or reactionary during these evaluations are frequently labeled as high conflict, which can lead to supervised visitation or restricted time, regardless of their past involvement. We must also analyze the demographic impact of parental alienation as a concept in 2026. While controversial and highly debated in psychological circles, the trend of one parent systematically undermining the child's relationship with the other parent is a documented factor in thousands of cases. For men, this often manifests as a sudden refusal by the child to visit. The historical response from courts was often slow, but modern data suggests that early intervention is the only effective countermeasure. Men who wait months for a court date to fix a broken visitation schedule often find that the status quo has become the new legal reality. In the world of family law, the status quo is a powerful demographic force. If a child has lived primarily with one parent for 6 months during a separation, the court is statistically unlikely to uproot that child's routine. Furthermore, let's look at the step-by-step reality of a move-away case. In our mobile society of 2026, it is common for one parent to want to relocate for a job or to be near extended family. This creates a demographic crisis for the father left behind. The historical trends in relocation cases have swung like a pendulum. Currently, the burden of proof often lies with the parent who wants to move to show that the relocation is in the child's best interest, not just the parent's best interest. However, if a man has not established a consistent, documented 50-50 or substantial timeshare prior to the move request, his ability to block that move is demographically slim. This highlights why the early stages of a separation are the most critical for a man's long-term relationship with his children. The financial intersection of custody is also a point of deep dive. In the U.S., child support and custody are legally separate, but demographically, they are inextricably linked. Many men find that the fight for 50-50 custody is perceived by the other party as an attempt to lower child support payments. This creates a cynical environment where a father's desire for time is framed as a financial maneuver. Navigating this requires a sophisticated understanding of the income shares model, used by most states in 2026. This model calculates support based on the combined income of both parents and the percentage of time the child spends with each. Men who enter negotiations with a clear-eyed understanding of these spreadsheets can often bypass the emotional traps that lead to years of expensive litigation. Another emerging demographic in 2026 is the use of parenting coordinators. These are court-appointed or privately retained individuals, often attorneys or mental health professionals, who have the authority to make tie-breaking decisions on the fly. Whether it is a dispute over which summer camp the child attends or a change in the holiday schedule, the parenting coordinator is the new referee. For the modern man, this represents a shift away from the courtroom and toward a more administrative form of dispute resolution. While it adds an extra layer of cost, the historical trend shows it can drastically reduce the number of emergency motions filed in court, preserving both the man's sanity and his legal budget. As we look at the historical evolution of the American father, we see a move toward integrated fatherhood. The demographic of the 1950s father was an external one, focused on the world outside the home. The demographic of the 2026 father is an internal one, deeply embedded in the daily rhythms of his children's lives. The family court system is still catching up to this reality, and the friction between the old tender years ghosts and the new equal parenting laws is where most men get caught. Understanding the psychological nuances of how judges perceive stability versus flexibility can be the difference between being a primary figure in a child's life or a visitor on a schedule. But as we master the dynamics of the courtroom and the custody evaluation, another shadow looms over the demographic landscape for men. It is a tool that is increasingly used in high-conflict cases, often as a tactical nuclear option that can end a custody battle before it even starts. It involves the intersection of family law and criminal justice, and it has the power to remove a man from his home and his children in a matter of hours based on an accusation alone. How have domestic violence restraining orders or silver bullets changed the demographic outcomes for men in the last decade? And what does the data say about the potential for misuse in a strategic divorce? In the next part, we examine the legal mechanisms of protection orders, the ex parte process, and the specific steps a man must take to protect his reputation and his rights when the conflict turns from civil to quasi-criminal. The intersection of family law and the criminal justice system has created a demographic phenomenon that many legal scholars refer to as the silver bullet. This term describes the tactical use of domestic violence restraining orders, or DVROs, to gain an immediate and overwhelming advantage in a divorce or custody proceeding. In the United States, the historical trend toward expanding protections for victims of domestic abuse is a cornerstone of modern civil rights. However, for the American male in 2026, the administrative reality of how these orders are processed can lead to catastrophic potential outcomes if the system is engaged without cause. To navigate this, you must understand the ex parte process. In almost every state, a person can walk into a courthouse, fill out a petition alleging a threat of violence or harassment, and receive a temporary restraining order from a judge without the accused person even being present. Imagine a man named Thomas in Charlotte, North Carolina. Thomas is a software engineer with no criminal record and a 10-year marriage that has hit a rough patch. One Tuesday afternoon while he is at work, his spouse files for an ex parte order. By 5 p.m., Thomas is met at his front door by a sheriff's deputy who informs him that he has 15 minutes to pack a bag and leave his home. He is barred from contacting his children, he cannot enter his own residence, and in some jurisdictions, his access to joint bank accounts is restricted to prevent him from fleeing. This is not a final judgment of guilt. It is a temporary protective measure. However, the demographic data shows that once a man is removed from the home via an ex parte order, The status quo for the custody battle is effectively set for the next several months. The historical trend in the U.S. has moved toward a broad definition of abuse. Historically, a restraining order required evidence of physical battery. By 2026, many states have expanded this to include coercive control, emotional abuse, and financial abuse. While these laws are designed to protect vulnerable individuals, the subjective nature of these definitions means that a heated argument or a disagreement over household spending can sometimes be framed as a legal basis for a protective order. Case studies indicate that roughly 70% of temporary restraining orders are eventually dismissed or dropped by the time they reach a full evidentiary hearing. Yet, the damage to a man's reputation and his immediate standing in a custody case is often already done. Step by step, a man must understand the life cycle of a protection order. After the initial ex parte order is served, a return hearing is usually scheduled within 10 to 21 days. This is the first time the accused man, like Thomas, gets to present his side of the story. Historical trends show that many men make a critical error here. They attempt to contact the other party to explain or apologize. In 2026, any contact, even a single text message saying "I am sorry" or "Can I see the kids?" is a violation of the order and can result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. For a man in a high-conflict divorce, the primary strategy during this window is absolute, zero-contact compliance. The court is looking for any reason to turn a temporary order into a permanent one, which can last for years and trigger federal firearm bans under the Lautenberg Amendment. The demographic impact of these orders extends deeply into employment. In 2026, many professional licenses and corporate security clearances are tied to background checks that flag active restraining orders. A man in the military, law enforcement, or the financial sector may find himself placed on administrative leave the moment an order is filed. This creates a secondary financial crisis, as he must now fund a high-stakes legal defense while his primary source of income is under threat. Data suggests that the psychological toll of this sudden isolation leads many men to agree to unfavorable divorce settlements just to have the restraining order lifted and regain access to their children. Furthermore, we must examine the role of evidence in 2026. We are living in a digital fishbowl. Historical trends in family court now lean heavily on digital forensics. Text messages, GPS data from smart cars, home security camera footage, and even social media check-ins are used to substantiate or refute claims of harassment. A case study from a 2025 California filing showed a man was able to have an order dismissed by producing data from his smartwatch that proved he was 5 miles away at the gym during the time of the alleged incident. For the modern man, your digital footprint is your most objective witness. Conversely, an impulsive email sent in a moment of anger can become the smoking gun that keeps you away from your children for years. There is also the demographic of the mutual restraining order. Sometimes, when both parties make allegations, a judge will issue orders against both. While this might seem like a wash, it creates a toxic legal environment where both parents are constantly at risk of arrest for minor technicalities during child exchanges. To mitigate this, historical trends have seen a surge in the use of supervised exchange locations, often at police stations or designated community centers. For a father, this is a humiliating but necessary step to ensure that there are third-party witnesses to every interaction, preventing further false allegations. It is also vital to discuss the psychological profile of the petitioner in high-conflict cases. Demographic research in 2026 highlights that in a subset of divorces, personality disorders play a significant role in the use of legal systems as a weapon of scorched earth litigation. Men who find themselves in these scenarios often report a pattern of gaslighting and projection. Understanding the clinical aspect of high-conflict personalities is not just for therapists. It is a core component of a man's legal strategy. If a man can demonstrate to the court a consistent pattern of his own calm, documented behavior in the face of erratic accusations, the judge's perception of the demographic roles can shift. We must also touch on the false allegation rate. While the vast majority of domestic violence reports are made in good faith, the demographic subset of false or exaggerated claims during divorce is a reality that the legal system struggles to balance. In 2026, some states are beginning to introduce penalties for the bad faith use of protective orders, but the burden of proof remains incredibly high for the accused. A man's best defense is not to attack the other party's character, but to provide an overwhelming wall of contradictory, documented facts. This is the shift from an emotional defense to a data-driven defense. As we conclude this deep dive into the quasi-criminal side of divorce, we see that the legal landscape for men has become a minefield where one wrong step can lead to a total loss of access and assets. But beyond the threats of restraining orders and the fear of the silver bullet, there is a broader, more systemic change occurring in the American economy that is redefining the very concept of the provider. The traditional roles that once defined a man's value in the home are being disrupted by the rise of the female breadwinner and the gig economy. How is the shifting income gap between men and women in 2026 creating a new class of men who are actually eligible for alimony from their wives? And why is there such a massive demographic stigma preventing men from claiming what is legally theirs? What happens to the math of divorce when the man is the one who stayed home to raise the children while the wife climbed the corporate ladder? In the next part, we break down the gender income reversal, the demographics of the stay-at-home dad in the U.S. court system, and the shocking data on how courts treat men who seek financial support from their former spouses. The gender income reversal is perhaps the most significant demographic disruption to the American family court system since the 1970s. For nearly a century, the financial architecture of divorce was built on the assumption of a male breadwinner and a female dependent. But by 2026, the data shows that in approximately 40% of American households, women are the primary or sole earners. This shift has created a massive cultural and legal lag. While the laws in most states are gender-neutral on paper, the historical trends suggest that men face a unique set of psychological and social barriers when the traditional roles are flipped. This is the era of the stay-at-home dad and the high-earning wife, a demographic that is growing but remains legally misunderstood by many men entering the system. Imagine a man named Jason in suburban Chicago. For the last 12 years, Jason has been the primary caregiver for his 3 children. He stepped away from a promising career in middle management to support his spouse, Sarah, as she climbed the ranks of a major pharmaceutical firm. In 2026, Sarah earns $450,000 a year, while Jason's income is effectively zero. When the marriage reaches a breaking point, Jason finds himself in a position that historically belonged to women. He is the economically vulnerable spouse. Under the law, Jason should be eligible for temporary and rehabilitative spousal maintenance, as well as an equitable share of the retirement accounts Sarah accumulated during the marriage. However, case studies show that men like Jason often hesitate to claim these assets due to a pervasive social stigma. Historical trends indicate that men often feel a sense of shame in seeking alimony, even when they have sacrificed a decade of earning potential to maintain the household. This hesitation can lead to disastrous potential outcomes. If Jason walks away without seeking maintenance, he is essentially starting from scratch at age 45 in a job market that views a 12-year gap in his resume with skepticism. The data from 2026 suggests that the legal system is actually more prepared for this reversal than men are. Judges are increasingly accustomed to seeing men in the dependent role, yet many men settle for far less than they are legally entitled to simply to avoid the perception of being supported by a former wife. Step by step, the calculation of alimony for a man in this position follows the same mathematical formulas used for women. The court looks at the standard of living established during the marriage, the duration of the marriage, and the time it will take for the lower-earning spouse to become self-sufficient. For Jason, this could mean receiving $5,000 a month for several years while he goes back to school or updates his professional certifications. Furthermore, in an equitable distribution state like Illinois, the house, the investments, and even the bonuses Sarah earned are all marital property. Men must realize that this isn't about winning or losing. It is about the demographic reality of a partnership where one person's career was subsidized by the other's domestic labor. The demographics of stay-at-home fathers also impact custody in ways that are often surprising. Historically, as we discussed with the tender years doctrine, the primary caregiver was almost always assumed to be the mother. In 2026, when a man like Jason can prove he was the one who handled the school runs, the sick days, and the homework, the best interests of the child standard swings heavily in his favor. However, a common historical trend in these cases is the working mother's guilt defense, where the higher-earning female spouse argues that the man's caregiving was somehow inadequate or that she was the one truly managing the household from her smartphone. Men in this demographic must be meticulously prepared with evidence of their daily involvement to counter these traditional narratives. We must also analyze the impact of the wage gap in reverse. While much has been written about the general gender wage gap, in certain urban demographics and among younger cohorts like Gen Z and late millennials, women are graduating college at higher rates and entering high-growth sectors more aggressively than their male counterparts. This means that for men in their late 20s and 30s, the likelihood of being the lower-earning spouse is higher than in any previous generation. The historical trend shows that these marriages are also statistically more likely to end in divorce if the husband feels a loss of status. Case studies in 2026 highlight that psychological counseling focused on deconstructing traditional breadwinner identities is becoming a staple of successful marital mediation. Consider the imagine-if scenario of a man who is not a stay-at-home dad but earns significantly less than his wife, perhaps $60,000 to her $200,000. In this scenario, child support often becomes a point of major contention. In many states, if the parents have 50-50 custody, the parent with the higher income still pays child support to the parent with the lower income to ensure the child's lifestyle remains consistent. For many men, the idea of receiving a child support check from their ex-wife feels like a blow to their masculinity. But from a demographic and legal perspective, that money belongs to the child's household, not the man. Overcoming this ego-driven barrier is essential for the financial stability of the post-divorce family. The historical evolution of professional goodwill is another critical factor. In many high-earning households, the primary asset isn't just the house or the 401k. It is the value of a professional practice or a business. If a man helped put his wife through medical school or supported her while she built a law firm, he may be entitled to a portion of the goodwill value of that business. This is a complex area of valuation that requires forensic accountants. In 2026, the demographics of wealth show that more men are finding themselves on the receiving end of these valuations. The step-by-step process involves calculating what the business is worth beyond its physical assets, its reputation, its client base, and its future earnings, all of which were built during the marriage. However, the demographic data also shows a darker side to the gender income reversal. Men who are primary earners still face the highest risk of significant wealth depletion. While more women are becoming breadwinners, the majority of high-net-worth individuals in the U.S. over the age of 50 are still men. For this demographic, the 2026 legal landscape is about mitigation. Prenuptial and postnuptial agreements have seen a 300% increase in usage among men in the last decade. This isn't just for the ultra-wealthy. It is for any man with a house or a small business. The historical trend has moved from these documents being seen as unromantic to being seen as essential financial insurance. As we look at the shifts in income and the changing face of the American provider, we see that the old rules no longer apply. A man's value in the eyes of the court is no longer tied strictly to his wallet, but his financial obligations and rights are more tied to the ledger than ever before. But what happens when the legal battle is over? The demographic data on the aftermath of divorce for men reveals a startling reality that few talk about. It is a period of high risk, not just financially, but physically and mentally. What are the specific health and mortality risks that men face in the first 5 years following a divorce? And how do these statistics vary across different age groups in 2026? Why is the loneliness epidemic hitting divorced men harder than any other demographic in U.S. history? In the next part, we step out of the courtroom and into the raw data of the post-divorce survival period, examining the health trends, the social isolation factors, and the step-by-step psychological rebuilding that is required to avoid becoming a statistic. The transition from the courtroom to the living room is where the demographic data for men in the United States takes a sobering turn. While the legal and financial battles are often the focus of a divorce, the post-divorce survival period is where the most significant long-term impact on a man's life is actually measured. Historical trends consistently show that men experience a sharper decline in physical and mental health following a marital dissolution compared to women. This is not just an anecdotal observation. It is a statistical reality documented across decades of American social science. In 2026, we are seeing this play out in what researchers call the divorce mortality gap. Imagine a man named Mark in Columbus, Ohio. Mark is 50 years old, recently divorced after a 24-year marriage. During his marriage, his social life was largely managed by his spouse. His diet was regulated by the presence of a family dinner structure. His preventative health checkups were often prompted by his partner's insistence. Once the decree is signed and Mark moves into a solo apartment, these invisible support structures vanish. Data from the Journal of Men's Health suggests that divorced men have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and a shortened life expectancy compared to their married counterparts. The demographic shift here is one of total lifestyle deregulation. Without the domestic anchor, men like Mark are statistically more likely to engage in high-risk behaviors, neglect nutritional needs, and experience chronic sleep deprivation. The psychological rebuilding process is a step-by-step journey that many men are unprepared for, because of the historical trend of emotional stoicism in American male culture. For generations, men were taught to keep their head down and work through the pain. However, the data from 2026 indicates that this grind-it-out mentality is a leading contributor to the social isolation epidemic. Men typically have fewer close confidants than women. While a woman might have a robust network of friends to process the emotional fallout, a man's social circle is often tied to his marriage or his workplace. When the marriage ends, the couple's friends often drift toward the wife, and the workplace remains a space where emotional vulnerability is seen as a liability. This leaves a man in a vacuum of silence. Consider the imagine-if scenario of the first holiday season after a divorce. For a man who has lost his home and sees his children only 50% of the time, the tradition of the family gathering is replaced by a profound sense of displacement. Historical trends in the U.S. show a spike in male depression and substance abuse during these periods. This is where the social isolation factor becomes a tangible health risk. The lack of meaningful social interaction triggers a physiological stress response that, over time, weakens the immune system. To navigate this, the step-by-step rebuilding of a personal social infrastructure is essential. This involves intentionally seeking out new communities, whether through hobby groups, fitness clubs, or fraternal organizations, that are independent of the previous marital identity. We also have to look at the demographic of the second adolescence that many men experience post-divorce. In an attempt to reclaim lost youth or numb the pain of the transition, many men in their 40s and 50s enter a phase of erratic lifestyle choices. While this might feel like freedom in the short term, the historical data suggests it often leads to a secondary financial and health crisis. Case studies from 2025 and 2026 highlight a trend of rebound debt, where men overspend on luxury items or high-cost dating experiences to project an image of success and recovery. This demographic behavior is often a mask for what sociologists call identity loss. When a man defines himself primarily as a provider and a husband for 2 decades, the removal of those titles leaves a void that a new car or a series of dates cannot fill. Furthermore, the data on parental identity in the post-divorce period is critical. For men who have successfully navigated the custody wars and secured 50-50 time, the challenge shifts to solo parenting, in a culture that still largely views the father as the secondary parent. The historical trend was the Disney dad, the father who takes the kids to the movies and buys them toys but doesn't handle the doctor visits or the discipline. In 2026, the demographic of the active solo father is rising, but it comes with a high level of stress. Men often struggle to balance the demands of a career with the logistical complexities of a household without a partner. Step by step, men must learn to build their own domestic systems. Everything from meal planning to managing a complex school calendar that were previously outsourced or shared. The mortality risks are perhaps the most jarring part of the raw data. Studies have shown that divorced men are significantly more likely to die from preventable causes than married men. This is often linked to the caregiving deficit. Historically, women have acted as the primary health monitors in the American family. Without that monitor, men often ignore symptoms that lead to late-stage diagnoses. In 2026, the potential outcomes for men who do not proactively seek a health proxy, be it a dedicated primary care physician or a health-focused peer group, are statistically grim. This is why the first step in any post-divorce recovery plan must be a comprehensive medical evaluation and the establishment of a sustainable wellness routine. There is also the career impact to consider. While we discussed the financial division of assets earlier, the demographic data shows that a man's productivity often takes a hit in the first 2 years after a divorce. The mental bandwidth required to navigate legal proceedings, relocate, and manage emotional stress often leads to a plateau or decline in professional growth. For many men, the fear of losing their job on top of their marriage creates a cycle of high cortisol stress. Case studies suggest that men who are transparent with their employers about their transition, without oversharing personal details, are more likely to receive the flexibility needed to stabilize their lives. As we look at the historical evolution of the American male's response to crisis, we see a shift from isolation to integration. The men who survive and thrive after a divorce in 2026 are those who treat their recovery with the same strategic discipline they applied to their careers. They understand that their health and their social connections are assets that must be managed. But as these men rebuild their lives, many find themselves standing on the edge of a new and unfamiliar frontier: the modern dating market. The demographic landscape of dating in the US has been completely transformed by technology and shifting social norms since these men were last single. How does a man in his 40s or 50s navigate the algorithm era of romance? And what are the specific demographic traps of the remarriage market in 2026? Why is serial monogamy becoming a financial risk for men who have already been through one high-stakes divorce? In the next part, we dive into the data of post-divorce relationships, the demographics of living together apart, and the step-by-step strategies for protecting your newly rebuilt life from the risks of a second marital failure. The modern dating market of 2026 presents a demographic landscape that is fundamentally unrecognizable to a man who has been out of the circuit for a decade or more. When we analyze the data of post-divorce relationships, we see a phenomenon called the digital mating gap. For the American man re-entering the market in his late 30s, 40s, or 50s, the shift from social circle dating to algorithmic dating is a shock to the system. Historical trends show that while men in their 20s struggle with a surplus of male users on dating applications, men over 40 who have stable careers and established lives actually enter a high-demand demographic. However, this demand comes with a new set of risks that the previous generation never had to navigate. Imagine a man named Steven in Denver. Steven is 47 and has recently stabilized his life after a 3-year legal battle. He enters the dating world expecting the norms of 2010, but finds a reality governed by swiping, ghosting, and hyperselection. More importantly, he finds a demographic of women who, like him, often come with complex financial histories, children, and significant skepticism. Data from the Pew Research Center in 2025 suggests that the majority of new relationships for divorced individuals now originate online, but these relationships have a different statistical trajectory than those formed in youth. For Steven, the risk is no longer just emotional. It is a risk of secondary asset depletion through what sociologists call serial monogamy. Serial monogamy is the historical trend of moving from one long-term, committed relationship to another without a significant break. For men, the potential outcomes of this behavior often include a premature merging of finances or households. In 2026, the cost of living and the housing crisis have created a demographic pressure to move in together quickly to share expenses. Step by step, this often leads to the same legal entanglements that the man just escaped. In some states, the concept of a de facto marriage or palimony can be triggered if a couple lives together for a certain period and shares financial responsibilities. For a man who has just spent a portion of his life savings on a divorce settlement, the financial risk of a second, poorly planned cohabitation is immense. This has led to the rise of a new demographic trend in the United States known as LAT, or living together apart. This involves two people in a committed, long-term relationship who intentionally maintain separate residences. Case studies from 2026 show that this model is becoming the preferred choice for divorced men with children. It allows for romantic intimacy and partnership without the legal and domestic friction of a shared household. By maintaining separate addresses, men protect their separate property status and ensure that their relationship with their children remains the primary focus of their home life. The data suggests that LAT relationships often report higher levels of satisfaction and lower levels of conflict because the daily stressors of chores and bills are decoupled from the romance. However, many men still desire a traditional remarriage, and the demographics here are stark. As we touched on earlier, the divorce rate for second marriages is statistically higher than for first marriages, often cited as being between 60 and 67%. Why is this? Historical trends suggest that people often choose a second spouse based on the opposite traits of their first spouse, a reaction known as the pendulum effect, rather than looking for fundamental compatibility. Furthermore, the complexity of blended families introduces a demographic variable that most men underestimate. The friction between step-parents and biological children is a leading cause of dissolution in second marriages. A man who enters a remarriage without a clear, step-by-step plan for household boundaries and financial segregation is statistically more likely to find himself back in family court within 5 to 7 years. Consider the imagine-if scenario where Steven decides to marry again. In 2026, the most effective tool for his demographic is the prenuptial agreement 2.0. Unlike the prenups of the past, these modern documents are often designed around the preservation of children's inheritance. If Steven has 2 children from his first marriage, his primary concern is ensuring that the assets he worked so hard to keep in the divorce are eventually passed down to them, rather than being diverted to a second spouse or the second spouse's children in the event of death or another divorce. The historical trend shows that modern prenups are becoming less about lack of trust and more about clear-eyed estate planning. Another demographic shift we see in 2026 is the impact of the gig economy on dating. Many men in their 50s are now working multiple consulting roles or side hustles to recover the wealth lost in a divorce. This limits their time and changes the demographics of who they meet. We are seeing an increase in workplace-adjacent relationships, which brings its own set of HR and legal risks. Case studies highlight that men in high-level positions are increasingly cautious about dating within their professional sphere, due to the rise of strict corporate conduct policies that have evolved since the late 2010s. We must also analyze the data on the remarriage market regarding age gaps. Historical trends in the U.S. have often shown men marrying younger women in second marriages. However, 2026 data indicates a shift toward peer dating. As women have gained more economic independence, the demographic of high-earning, divorced women in their 40s and 50s has become a significant force in the market. These women often seek men who are not just financial providers, but emotional partners. For a man like Steven, this requires a demographic shift in his own behavior. The silent generation model of masculinity is less effective in this market than an emotionally intelligent model. Men who invest in their own psychological health post-divorce are significantly more successful in securing stable long-term partnerships in this new demographic. The financial math of the second marriage also involves the alimony trap. In many states, if a man is receiving spousal maintenance from his first wife, that maintenance typically ends the moment he remarries or, in some cases, begins cohabitating. Conversely, if he is the one paying alimony, his obligation does not end just because he has a new spouse. This creates a demographic of permanent bachelors, men who choose to never remarry specifically to avoid the financial recalculations that the state would impose. They remain in long-term, committed, but legally unlinked relationships to maintain the financial status quo. Step by step, protecting yourself in the 2026 dating world involves a three-pronged strategy. First, a mandatory cooling-off period of at least 2 years post-divorce before making any major relationship commitments. Second, the use of legal consultation before moving a partner into a home you own. Third, a transparent conversation about financial expectations and estate planning within the first 6 months of a serious relationship. This isn't about being unromantic. It is about recognizing that in the United States, marriage is a legal and economic contract with profound historical baggage. As we look at the men who successfully navigate the dating market and the complexities of remarriage, we see that they share a common trait. They have moved from being reactive to being proactive. They understand the demographics of the market they are in. But while a man may have fixed his social life and secured his assets against future relationship risks, there is one final frontier that often remains a source of hidden vulnerability. It is the demographic shift in how the government and the tax system view the divorced man as he enters his peak earning years or approaches retirement. How do the tax laws of 2026 specifically penalize the single, high-earning male compared to the married couple? And what are the tax brackets of the divorced that can eat away at your recovery? What happens to your Social Security and pension benefits if you were married for more than 10 years? And why is this 10-year mark the most critical demographic milestone in U.S. history? In the next part, we go into the deep math of the IRS, the Social Security Administration, and the specific strategies used by wealthy men to shield their recovery from the divorce tax. The financial landscape of 2026 presents a unique set of challenges for the divorced man, particularly when he interacts with the Internal Revenue Service and the Social Security Administration. To navigate this, we must look at the historical evolution of the tax code and how it has shifted from supporting the family unit to effectively increasing the fiscal burden on the single male earner. In the United States, the most significant and often overlooked financial transition after a divorce is the loss of the married filing jointly status. This is not just a change in a checkbox. It is a fundamental shift into a higher tax bracket for the same level of income. Imagine a man named Christopher in Seattle. In 2026, Christopher earns $185,000 a year as a senior project manager. While he was married, his household benefited from the wider tax brackets associated with joint filing. Once his divorce is finalized, Christopher is pushed into the single filer category. Because the U.S. tax system is progressive, a larger portion of his top-tier earnings is now taxed at a higher percentage. This is the divorce tax in its most literal form. For a man in Christopher's position, this can result in a net loss of thousands of dollars in annual take-home pay, even before child support or alimony are factored in. Historical trends show that men often fail to adjust their withholdings immediately after a split, leading to a secondary crisis. a massive unexpected tax bill the following April. One of the most critical demographic milestones in U.S. history for any married man is the 10-year mark. Under the rules of the Social Security Administration, if a marriage lasts for at least 10 years, a divorced spouse is entitled to claim benefits based on their former partner's earnings record. For a man who was the primary earner, this means his former spouse can eventually draw a benefit equal to up to 50% of his retirement amount without reducing his own monthly check. While this doesn't take money directly out of the man's pocket, it is a demographic factor that impacts the long-term solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund and influences how men in their 50s and 60s plan for their sunset years. Case studies suggest that men who divorce at year 9 or 11 experience vastly different long-term social safety net outcomes. Furthermore, we must analyze the historical shift regarding the deductibility of alimony. Prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, alimony was tax-deductible for the payer and taxable income for the recipient. For marriages dissolved after December 31, 2018, this was reversed. In 2026, a man paying $3,000 a month in spousal maintenance is doing so with after-tax dollars. This means he must earn approximately $4,500 to pay that $3,000, depending on his tax bracket. This historical change has significantly increased the real-world cost of divorce for men, yet many still enter negotiations using outdated mental math from the previous era. Step by step, a man must calculate his net income after taxes and after support to understand his actual survival budget. The demographic of the wealthy man in 2026 uses specific strategies to shield his recovery, often involving the strategic use of Qualified Domestic Relations Orders, or QDROs. While we touched on this in terms of asset division, the tax implications are deep. When a retirement account like a 401k is split via a QDRO, the transfer is typically a non-taxable event. However, if a man tries to pay out a settlement by withdrawing cash from his retirement account, he is hit with immediate income tax and potentially a 10% early withdrawal penalty if he is under age 59 and a half. Historical trends show that men who lack sophisticated tax advice during a divorce often liquidate the wrong assets, effectively giving the government a 20 to 30% cut of their remaining net worth. Consider the imagine-if scenario of the family home. In 2026, with the real estate market in a state of flux, the capital gains exclusion is a vital tool. A married couple can exclude up to $500,000 of gain on the sale of a primary residence. A single man can only exclude $250,000. If Christopher and his spouse sell their home during the divorce, they utilize the full $500,000. If he buys her out and sells the house years later as a single man, he is exposed to a much higher tax liability on the appreciation. This is a demographic trap that punishes the spouse who keeps the house. The strategic move seen in modern case studies is to sell the asset while the joint filing status is still active, or to negotiate a credit in the settlement for the future tax liability. Another layer of the deep math involves the head of household filing status. For a divorced man with 50/50 custody, only one parent can claim the child as a dependent and file as head of household in a given tax year. This status provides a higher standard deduction and more favorable tax brackets than the single status. Historical trends show that many men simply concede this to the mother, unaware of the compounding financial loss over a decade. In 2026, savvy men are negotiating alternating years for the head of household status in their divorce decrees. This step-by-step approach to tax sharing is a hallmark of the demographic that recovers their wealth the fastest. We also have to look at the PEAS limitations and the phase-out of itemized deductions. As a man's income rises post-divorce, perhaps due to working more hours to cover new expenses, he may find that his ability to deduct mortgage interest or state and local taxes is capped. The demographic of the high-earning single male is one of the most heavily taxed groups in the American system. This is why the use of tax-advantaged vehicles like health savings accounts and maximized 401k contributions becomes even more critical after a divorce. It is not just about saving for the future. It is about lowering the taxable income base that the divorce tax is calculated upon. The demographics of the self-employed man face an even more complex intersection. If a man owns a business, the divorce court may see the business's gross revenue as his personal income for the purposes of calculating child support, while the IRS sees only the net profit. This discrepancy can lead to a situation where a man is legally obligated to pay support based on money he never actually takes home. Case studies in 2026 highlight the importance of a forensic accounting approach that aligns the court's view of income with the IRS's reality. Men who fail to do this often find themselves in a cash flow squeeze, where their total obligations exceed their actual liquidity. As we examine these historical trends and the deep math of the U.S. financial system, it becomes clear that the divorce decree is just the beginning of a long-term fiscal relationship with the state. The men who thrive are those who stop viewing themselves as victims of a settlement and start viewing themselves as the CEO of a new, leaner entity. But even with the taxes managed and the retirement accounts shielded, there is a looming demographic shift that is beginning to redefine the very end of the male life cycle in America. It is a trend that is breaking the traditional concepts of inheritance and legacy. What is the inheritance wipeout occurring in 2026, where the costs of late-stage divorce and long-term care are depleting the generational wealth of American men at record speeds? How are the demographics of the unmarried senior creating a crisis in the U.S. probate courts? And why are men more likely to see their estates contested than women? In the next part, we explore the demographics of the final chapter, the rise of the solo senior, and the specific legal protections every man needs to ensure his life's work doesn't end up in the hands of the state or an unintended beneficiary. The demographic reality of the American male in his final chapter has undergone a seismic shift due to the rising trend of gray divorce. In 2026, we are witnessing the first generation of men who are entering their 70s and 80s as single individuals in numbers never before seen in U.S. history. This is the era of the solo senior. Historically, the family unit served as the primary vehicle for elder care and wealth transfer. When a marriage dissolves late in life, the traditional safety net of a spouse and a unified family estate is often shredded, leaving the man to navigate the complex world of probate, long-term care, and estate planning alone. This has led to what sociologists call the inheritance wipeout, a phenomenon where the assets intended for the next generation are consumed by the high costs of independent living and legal disputes. Imagine a man named William in Phoenix, Arizona. At 72, William finalized a divorce after 45 years of marriage. He walked away with half of the marital home's equity and half of his pension. In his mind, he still has a significant legacy to leave to his 2 children. However, as a solo senior in 2026, William faces a different demographic math. Without a spouse to provide informal care, a minor health setback requires him to hire private in-home assistance or move into an assisted living facility. In many U.S. cities, these services can cost between $5,000 and $12,000 per month. Because he is single, he cannot take advantage of the spousal impoverishment protections that allow a healthy spouse to keep a portion of assets while the other qualifies for Medicaid. For William, the wealth he spent 40 years accumulating is now being liquidated at an alarming rate to cover basic survival costs. The historical trend of the gray divorce also introduces the complication of the second estate. Many men in William's position eventually find a new partner. While this provides companionship, it creates a demographic collision in the probate courts. In 2026, we are seeing a record number of contested wills where children from a first marriage are pitted against a second spouse, or even a long-term cohabitant. Without a robust, step-by-step estate plan that includes a living trust and specific beneficiary designations, a man's life's work can be tied up in litigation for years. Data from the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel shows that single men are statistically less likely to have updated their estate documents following a divorce than women, leading to unintended beneficiaries, like a former spouse, receiving assets due to outdated paperwork. Step by step, the protection of a man's legacy in the 2026 demographic landscape requires a transition from a simple will to a comprehensive trust-based strategy. A will must go through probate, which is a public, time-consuming, and expensive process. A living trust, however, allows assets to pass to heirs privately and immediately. For a divorced man, this is critical because it prevents the state from taking a significant cut in probate fees and keeps the family's financial business out of the public record. Furthermore, the use of a power of attorney for healthcare and a durable power of attorney for finances is a demographic necessity for the solo senior. If William becomes incapacitated without these documents, the court will appoint a professional guardian, a stranger who will charge the estate to make decisions on his behalf. We must also analyze the historical trend of the Social Security death benefit and survivor benefits. In the past, these were straightforward transfers to a surviving widow. In the modern era of multiple marriages and divorces, the rules are far more intricate. If a man was married to his first wife for over 10 years and then remarried, both the current spouse and the former spouse may have claims to survivor benefits upon his death. Understanding these potential outcomes is essential for any man trying to calculate the actual support his heirs will receive. The demographic data suggests that many men inadvertently leave their families in a state of financial chaos because they assume the state will simply figure it out. Consider the imagine-if scenario of the final gift. In 2026, many men are choosing to utilize inter vivos gifts, giving assets to their children while they are still alive, rather than waiting for a probate transfer. This demographic shift is a direct response to the rising costs of late-life divorce and the fear of the state's long-term care clawback provisions. By transferring assets early, men can ensure their children receive their inheritance while also potentially qualifying for state-funded care later on, provided they navigate the 5-year look-back period required by Medicaid. This is a high-level strategic move that requires precise timing and historical knowledge of state-specific laws. The demographics of the solo senior also highlight a crisis in social capital. Historically, the matriarch of the family acted as the kinkeeper, maintaining the bonds between father and children. After a late-life divorce, many men find their relationship with their adult children becomes strained or distant. This emotional distance often translates into a lack of physical support during health crises. Case studies in 2026 show that men who proactively invest in relational maintenance, independent of their former spouse, have significantly better health outcomes and lower rates of estate litigation. The legacy a man leaves is not just the balance in his brokerage account. It is the strength of the tribe he has built to succeed him. Furthermore, we see a rise in the use of long-term care insurance among divorced men. While married couples often rely on each other for care, the solo senior recognizes that his independence is his most valuable asset. The historical trend shows that men who purchase these policies in their 50s or early 60s are far more likely to preserve their estate for their heirs. In 2026, these policies have evolved to include hybrid features that pay out a death benefit if the care is never needed, mitigating the risk of paying for nothing. This is a demographic tool for the man who understands that in a post-divorce world, he is his own primary safety net. The final chapter for the American man is no longer a predictable path of retirement and inheritance. It is a dynamic, high-stakes navigation of legal hurdles and shifting family structures. The demographics of 2026 tell us that the men who finish strong are those who have a clear-eyed understanding of their solo status and have taken the technical steps to anchor their legacy. They are the men who have reconciled their past, secured their present, and fortified their future against the unpredictability of the state and the legal system. As we reach the conclusion of this masterclass, we have covered the entire arc of the male experience in the U.S. divorce landscape, from the first filing to the final estate transfer. But there is one last perspective we must examine. It is the big picture view of the future. What does the demographic data say about the next generation of men who are watching this unfold today? Are we seeing a permanent decline in the institution of marriage? Or is a new, more resilient model of the American family beginning to emerge from the ashes of the no-fault era? In the final part, we synthesize everything we have learned to look at the future of the American male, the rise of contractual partnerships, and the ultimate step-by-step blueprint for building a life that is truly divorce-proof. The future of the American male in the landscape of 2026 is defined by a shift from social obligation to intentional architecture. As we synthesize the historical trends we have analyzed, from the legal upheaval of the 1970s to the algorithmic dating markets of the present, we see the emergence of a new demographic, the contractual partner. This is a man who no longer views marriage through the lens of 1950s romanticism, but as a sophisticated, high-stakes legal and financial merger that requires active management. The data suggests that the next generation of men, particularly Gen Z and those following them, are entering into domestic arrangements with a level of scrutiny that would have been unthinkable to their grandfathers. This isn't a sign of the death of the family, but rather the evolution of its survival in a no-fault world. Imagine a young man named Ethan in 2026. Ethan is 28, a civil engineer, and is considering moving in with his partner. Unlike previous generations who might have drifted into cohabitation through a series of sleepovers that turned permanent, Ethan represents the new demographic trend of pre-domestic planning. He and his partner have already discussed their individual debt-to-income ratios, their expectations for future childcare, and how their assets will be segregated. They are part of a growing historical trend in the U.S., where couples are utilizing cohabitation agreements before even considering a marriage license. This step-by-step approach to relationship building acts as a pressure test, ensuring that the partnership is built on a foundation of shared reality rather than just shared chemistry. The data from 2026 indicates that the age of first marriage continues to climb, now averaging 32 for men. This demographic delay is a massive protective factor. Historical trends show that marriages entered into after age 30, where both partners have established careers and a degree of financial independence, are significantly more resilient. For Ethan, this delay isn't about fear. It is about risk mitigation. By the time he marries, he will have a decade of individual financial history and a fully developed prefrontal cortex. This is the blueprint for a divorce-proof life. Building the individual first so that the partnership is a choice between two whole entities rather than a desperate merger of two incomplete ones. We must also analyze the rise of the beta marriage or the starter marriage as a demographic learning tool. While historically viewed as failures, these early short-lived unions are being re-evaluated in 2026 as essential data points for the modern man. Case studies suggest that men who have experienced a short-term marital dissolution in their 20s often go on to have the most stable and successful long-term marriages in their 30s and 40s. They have seen the mechanics of the legal system firsthand and enter their second unions with a surgical focus on communication and legal clarity. This is the demographic of the informed remarrier, a group that is increasingly utilizing postnuptial agreements as a standard operating procedure for marital maintenance. Furthermore, we are seeing the emergence of the parenting-first partnership. In 2026, the demographic of people who choose to raise children together without a traditional romantic marriage is growing. These are individuals who prioritize the stability of the child and the efficiency of the domestic unit over the volatility of romantic love. While still a minority, the historical trend toward delinking child rearing from marriage is a response to the 50-year volatility of the divorce courts. For a man, this provides a clear step-by-step legal framework for his rights and obligations as a father, without the entanglement of spousal maintenance or the equitable distribution of his future business assets. The blueprint for building a divorce-proof life in 2026 involves 5 distinct pillars. Step 1 is the separation of identity from the breadwinner role. As we have seen, when a man's entire self-worth is tied to his paycheck, a divorce is not just a financial loss. It is a psychological annihilation. The modern man must diversify his sources of validation, hobbies, community service, and deep friendships, so that no single legal decree can wipe out his sense of self. Step 2 is the maintenance of separate property. In an era of commingling, the man who keeps his premarital assets in a separate, untouched account is the man who retains his leverage. This is not about a lack of trust. It is about the historical reality of how property is transmuted in the U.S. court system. Step 3 is the radical transparency of the digital age. In 2026, there are no secrets from the forensic accountant or the digital investigator. A divorce-proof life is built on a foundation of honest ledgers and clean digital footprints. Men who live with the knowledge that every text, every transaction, and every check-in is a potential exhibit in a courtroom tend to make better decisions in the moment. Step 4 is the investment in emotional intelligence as a survival skill. The demographic data shows that high-conflict divorces are almost always fueled by a lack of emotional regulation. A man who can navigate a disagreement without triggering the scorched earth response of the legal system is a man who preserves his wealth and his access to his children. Step 5 is the continuous update of the legal map. The laws of 2026 are not the laws of 2036. A man must treat his domestic legal standing like he treats his professional certifications, something to be reviewed and updated every few years. Whether it is updating a trust, adjusting a parenting plan as children grow, or reviewing the beneficiaries on a life insurance policy, the proactive man is never caught off guard by a change in the status quo. This is the move from a set-it-and-forget-it mentality to a model of active marital management. As we look at the potential outcomes for the American male, we see a divergence. On one side is the man who ignores the demographics, ignores the history, and ignores the math, continuing to walk the path of traditional expectations into a system that has fundamentally changed. On the other side is the man who has watched this masterclass, who understands the data, and who uses the historical trends as a compass. This man doesn't fear the statistics because he has removed himself from the demographic of the vulnerable. He has built a life where his happiness is not a hostage to a legal contract, and his legacy is secured by his own strategic actions. The history of divorce in the United States is a history of the struggle for individual autonomy within the framework of the family. For the man in 2026, that struggle is being won through information. We have traveled from the fault-based courtrooms of the 1920s to the AI-assisted mediations of the present day. We have seen the rise and fall of the breadwinner, the evolution of the father from visitor to co-parent, and the shifting of the financial burden from the spouse to the state and back again. The tools for a successful, stable, and protected life are now in your hands. This concludes our 10-part deep dive into the demographics of divorce help for men in U.S. history. You now possess a level of insight that puts you in the top 1% of informed citizens regarding the domestic legal landscape. But understanding the terrain is only half the battle. The other half is execution. How do you take these high-level historical trends and apply them to your specific situation tomorrow morning? What are the first 3 phone calls you need to make if you suspect your household is shifting? And how do you find the specific professionals who understand this 2026 demographic reality? While this masterclass has ended, your journey into the strategic management of your life is just beginning. Keep your eyes on the data, keep your emotions in check, and always remember that in the world of family law, the most prepared man is the one who never has to go to court.